Good evening and welcome back to ParaGhoul Paranormal Discoveries from the Dark. In case you're new here, this radio show and podcast dives deep into the shadows of Saskatchewan's past to learn what lies within. Sometimes we even go to other locations across Canada to talk dark history, mysteries, and urban legends or even monsters. I'm your host, K.D. Kulpa, and I'm a horror author and paranormal researcher here in Regina, Saskatchewan. I love digging into the past to bring life to the ghosts and monsters hiding in the dark. And I especially love going live every week with you to tell you what I've uncovered. Tonight, we're going back into the history of the paranormal industry. But this time I thought we'd do something a little different and, go think about something else. I've been researching into a Canadian case that had left everyone baffled, and no body or sign of survival was ever left behind, leading to the use of mediums and paranormal equipment to try and solve the case. Picture the bustling city of Toronto in the year of 1919, but beneath the surface, an unsettling mystery shocked the community, and the case went cold. Tonight, let's explore the clues behind the disappearance of Ambrose Small. Now, if you're like me, your first question might be, who was Ambrose Small? Ambrose Joseph Small was born on January 11th of 1866 in Bradford, which is a small urban area north of Toronto, Ontario. His father, Daniel Smith, was an Irish Catholic immigrant that had settled in the area. And from the articles that I read about the family, his father was where they think Ambrose likely got his extremely strong work ethic. Around 1876, the Small family did end up moving to Toronto, and apparently in 1880, Daniel Small became the owner of the Grand Hotel on Adelaide Street West. Now, this allowed Ambrose Small to be involved in the Grand Opera House, which was right next door, by 1884, so as a teenager. Now, over the years, he slowly made his way from usher, as that teenager, to treasurer of the business. Unfortunately, he ended up having some sort of an argument with the manager of the Grand Opera House, and leading him to leave the business to instead work for the Toronto Opera House in 1889. Now, this allowed him to eventually become manager of that opera house as he learned the workings of the theater even further, and eventually he ended up buying and owning 2 Toronto theaters himself. So that wasn't all he decided to become invested in either. An article on the Dictionary of Canadian Biography says that he went on to start a stock company with Robert C. Cummings in 1897. Eventually, he started buying even more theaters, but in other areas such as Hamilton, Kingston, St. Thomas, and Peterborough. He was also elected president of the Canadian Theatrical Managers Association in 1906 and ended up having control of as many as 34 theaters. Whether through direct ownership, lease, or just being involved in controlling the bookings and the lineup that went through them. Now, obviously, you could probably tell that this allowed Ambrose Small to grow a bit of a small fortune for himself. This, combined with the inheritance he and his wife received allowed them to even purchase the Grand Opera House in 1903. So apparently this was something that, Ambrose Small was insistent he was going to do one day, maybe to get back at the manager that he argued with, I'm not sure. But apparently his wife was well aware of the chorus girls that enjoyed her husband. So the same article talks about Small actually adding a secret room within the Grand Opera House that had a bed, a picture of a nude woman, and a bar. And so apparently this was put into the Grand Opera House so that he could have his affairs. Now, I should also note, as it adds a bit more complexity to the mystery, Ambrose Small was not only known as a corrupt businessman that would cheat others, he was also known to be heavily involved in gambling, or more specifically in horse racing. So we have a man that was rich. He owned a mansion with his wife within Toronto, but he also liked to cheat on said wife with women from the Grand Opera House, whether they're actresses or chorus girls. And on top of that, he was known for being deceitful in his business dealings, and he liked to gamble. There was even some articles that stated he liked to even fix the horse races that he bet on. So as you can tell, it's shaping up to show that there would have been a lot of people with motive to get rid of this man. Now, unfortunately, the theatrical touring business was becoming more and more expensive as production costs continued to increase. So this led to Ambrose Small deciding that it was time to sell some of his theaters off. And he ended up doing so at $1.7 million, which is a lot of money back in the 1910s, right? And he sold it to the Trans-Canada Theatres Limited. Now, this was the start to the mystery, because as of December 1st, 1919, Ambrose Small signed the paperwork to give over his theaters to the buyer, which meant he was instantly going to be given a $1 million check for the sale, with the rest coming later on. Now, he was reported to have made some very expensive purchases for his wife right away. So apparently on December 2nd, he, bought a Cadillac for her, a fur coat, some expensive jewelry, before meeting with his attorney at the Grand Opera House, before his attorney Flock had to catch a train to London at 6 p.m. Now, originally, Flock was considered to be the last person known to see Ambrose Small alive. Now, you might think a man like Ambrose, who just put $1 million into the bank and had another $750,000 coming to him on an annual basis over the next 20 years, would be a hard person to miss. However, his disappearance wasn't actually reported for more than 2 weeks after December 2nd, even though no one had actually seen him. The claim goes that his wife had initially, said about his disappearance, "Oh, I believe my Ambi," they had called him Ambi back then, "is in the hands of a designing woman somewhere and will come back." So she just assumed, one of his mistresses that he had been with, they had run off together, but eventually he would come back because he'd want his money and, he was a businessman of Toronto, so he'd want to come back for it. Now, eventually, after he still wasn't returning home, his wife did finally offer first a $500 reward to anyone that would provide information about where he went, and then eventually that would be up to, I think it was $500,000. Now, in the Toronto World newspaper on January 5th, 1920, so like a month after his initial disappearance, I did find an article that starts with "Diligent inquiry sheds no light on small mystery. Wide search fails to reveal whereabouts of missing millionaire. Last seen by newsboy." So according to the papers, Flock might not have been the last to see Ambrose Small alive after all. There are a few people that claimed to have seen him on the night of his disappearance, some even claiming they had talked to him earlier that day, and the first being someone named Fred Lamb. So I'll read you the short section from the Toronto World that discusses Fred Lamb's statement. So it goes to say, "As to the story published in the Sunday World that Fred Lamb of the Hotel Lamb, corner Yonge and Adelaide Streets, had seen Mr. Small at 7:30 on the evening of the Tuesday when he disappeared. It ought to be said that Lamb sticks to his statement, that he had reasons for checking up the date, and had done some things the day in question that enabled him to verify his recollection of talking with Mr. Small on that Tuesday evening. He remembers Mr. Small going out about 7:30, telling him, Mr. Lamb, he was for home by streetcar, that he had not brought his motor to downtown, and that he would buy some papers. Mr. Lamb said further that he had asked the newsboy about it, and that the newsboy remembers Mr. Small buying a New York Times and a Toronto paper on the occasion." Now, according to this article, there were many rumors going around where Small might have disappeared to without telling anyone. Some claimed he had gone to Boston, but his wife had said, that was likely based on their plans to actually go to Boston for the upcoming holiday season to visit family. Others claimed that he must be in a sanatorium for a complete rest after the sale and stress of selling off his many theaters. Some of those involved with the sale of the theaters, including Flock, his attorney, had mentioned that Small had said something about going away for a rest after the deal was done, so they assumed that was where he went. Yet another theory, of course, was that he had been under foul play and would never be seen alive again. He hadn't been seen at the horse races where he liked to frequent. Others felt that maybe he went down to America to even get involved in, betting and races down there as part of his mental rest. But no one could find him. There were a couple of interesting pieces to the article, however, that makes you wonder about why more were not taking the situation more seriously, especially given the fact that the money Small had just made, so the $1 million he had just, put into the bank, hadn't been touched. And it was said that he had very little money actually on him, unless, of course, he had pocketed money away in the Grand Opera House that nobody knows about. I guess maybe there's that option, but they didn't think he had much money on him. But here are two more clips from that same article from earlier that made me pause. First, here's a small paragraph about a statement the Toronto World had received from the police. Now remember, this is over a month after his disappearance. At a late hour last night, the police stated that they had not yet been officially informed of Mr. Small's disappearance, and therefore are unable to take any action. It is understood, however, that they will be applied to help today, and the reward for information as to his whereabouts will speedily be announced by a circular bearing a description and photograph of the missing millionaire. So it had been almost a month since he was last seen, or no, more than a month since he was last seen, and yet no one had formally approached the police, not even his wife. So finally, the article continues that the sudden disappearance actually followed another. So this article ends with the final paragraph. A curiously similar case of disappearance to that of Ambrose J. Small occurred in Toronto perhaps 40 years ago, when the manager and owner of the old Royal Opera House dropped out and was never heard of. Some old-timers can recall the sensation that was created. Mr. Kiro was reputed to be a wealthy man. Nothing ever came to light afterwards to indicate that he had got financially involved in any way. He had many friends and no enemies. He was in no ill health, nor so far was known in trouble of any kind. But he left his overcoat hanging in the box office of the theater, walked out on King Street, and was never again heard of. Gradually, the mystery of his disappearance was forgotten and is only remembered now by its similarity to the strange case of Ambrose J. Small. So there were actually two disappearances in Toronto, both related to the theater organizations, or to the theater community. So the plot thickens. Now, when the police were finally involved in the case, the primary suspect at first was actually his personal secretary, James Doughty. So apparently Doughty had disappeared around the same time that Ambrose Small did, and he had last been seen cashing $100,000 in bonds. So eventually Doughty was found. He had been found in Oregon in the U.S. and had been arrested, but they didn't have enough evidence to prove that he might have been involved in Small's disappearance, even though prior to that he was known for complaining about how Ambrose Small was cheap and not paying him enough, and that one day he was going to kill him and take his money. So, kind of makes him a really big prime suspect. Instead, he was only charged with the theft of the bonds, which ended up being taken from Small's bank safety deposit box. So he did end up stealing money from Small in the end, but they couldn't prove that he murdered him. So apparently the police did search Small's private room for clues in the Grand Opera House, but couldn't find anything. They also dug up the basement in the Small's mansion in case his wife had been involved and buried him, but they didn't find anything there. They dug up the basement of the Grand Opera House, and they also checked a nearby ravine to see if any, body parts had been thrown in. But there were still no clues of Small anywhere. Now, of course, this was over a month later, so a lot can happen in a month, right? The mystery was taking so long, they even tried to get Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, so if you remember, that's the author of Sherlock Holmes, on the case. And in an article of the Border City Star, which is a newspaper in Windsor, Ontario, on Tuesday, April 11th of 1922, nearly 3 years after the initial appearance, this is what was stated about Arthur Conan Doyle. So, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, famous British author, creator of the character Sherlock Holmes, and one of the world's leading spiritualists, accepted a chronological resume of the well-known Ambrose Small mystery in Toronto today. A Star reporter outlined briefly the facts in the disappearance of Ambrose Small. Sir Arthur stated he was very busy and could not go into the matter at the time. That same article later stated that Arthur had said he hadn't heard of the case before, but to leave the facts with them and he would try to look into it. That was apparently the last that he talked about it, so it kind of sounds like, this newspaper journalist had given him the facts hoping that he would take the case, but he ignored them and moved on. So finally in 1923, Ambrose Small was declared dead, and the case was officially closed in 1960. Now, since this mystery still isn't fully solved, there are many speculations as to what might have actually happened to Ambrose Small. Apparently, a couple books have even, been written about it and have made claims into what happened, both ending, of course, with Small having been murdered. So that is kind of the consensus, is that he probably was murdered. His body was probably gotten rid of, and, that was the end of it. One of the books speculated that his body was likely burned in the furnace of the Grand Opera Theatre, and that's why they couldn't find a body, because, forensics aren't like what they are today, so it would have been harder for them to find it, especially since they didn't start looking for him until a month after his disappearance. So it is possible that they couldn't find anything. In another book, which is called The Missing Millionaire, and it's by Katie Dobbs, and she published it in 2019, so a fairly recent book on the matter, had another theory from one of the original investigators on the case that was that his wife, Mrs. Small, and the secretary, so that was Doughty, if you recall, had actually worked together, with Doughty killing Small and then Mrs. Small covering it up. So that was another one. So I don't know if she found some of the original investigative notes, because, you can, a lot of times you can get those things nowadays. So it might have been that. I didn't go digging that far, but the family did go on to try to find even, answers beyond the police, though, before 1923. And that I found out in an article by the Border City Star, and that was in March of 1922, shortly before the decision, like I said, that he would be dead by the courts. The article states the Smalls sisters decided they would take a different approach. So here's a paragraph from that article from the Border City Star. The Mrs. Small, sisters of Ambrose Small, theatrical magnate who has been missing for more than 2 years, will try spiritualism in an effort to solve the mystery of their brother's disappearance, according to the dispatch to the Toronto Star today from Windsor, Ontario. The dispatch intimates that the sisters of the missing millionaire have accepted the offer of Mrs. Sidney Noonan, a spiritualistic medium of Windsor, to invoke the hidden voices of spirits in an endeavor to find some trace of Mr. Small, dead or alive. Mrs. Noonan says she still thinks he is alive, and with the aid of the sisters, will undertake the necessary trances to prove it. Now, another interesting article I found was from April 22nd, 1923. And so this one was actually in the US. It refers to it being from Toronto, but I couldn't find the original Toronto paper. But this one's from Spokesman's Review, which is a newspaper out of Spokane, Washington. And so it talks about Mrs. Small was trying to get her husband declared dead 3 years before typical. So if she wins, And she must have eventually won, because all of the other articles that I found that talked about this case did mention that he was declared dead in 1923. So obviously she must have eventually, won that. But it did say that typically the law requires at least 7 years after disappearance in this article before they will make that claim that the person is dead, even without, the body or any sort of evidence stating that he probably was no longer. Now, according to this article, Small's two sisters, which we just kind of heard about, they were the ones that had decided they would turn to a spiritualistic medium in Windsor to try and find their brother. They were actually fighting against this, claim that he was dead even prior to the end of the 7 years. Now, of course, when Small is declared dead, this meant that his will would move forward, his will and testament, and so that would mean his fortune would finally be released to his wife. So that 1.7 million he made right before his death, like right before his disappearance, that would finally actually be released to his wife. So up to that point, it had been frozen, of course, because he wasn't around to make any claims to it. So she would finally have access to that. So the article claimed that another mystery that had since come up from his disappearance was that his watch had been found under his pillow. So the mystery behind this is that it was the same watch that he supposedly had showed to the barber the day that he disappeared. Now, this was the first that I heard of this watch, and I did find an Ontario newspaper that also kind of commented on the supposed article that's in the Toronto World, which I can't find. But I couldn't find anything prior to this about this watch. Supposedly, the watch had, been found under his pillow, which seems kind of funny because you'd think if Mrs. Small was involved, she would have removed his watch from under his pillow a long time ago. Although it did say in an article that the two of them actually slept in separate bedrooms in the mansion. So maybe she never went to check his bed for clues. I'm not sure. But anyway, it does kind of put Mrs. Small into even more suspicious light if this watch, clue is real. Now, Mrs. Small died in 1935, so we might not ever get to know what truly happened the night of his disappearance. Nowadays, however, the claims from paranormal investigators is that Ambrose Small actually haunts the Grand Opera House. So apparently, his ghost has been seen walking around the Grand Opera House and has been determined to be, unrest, because of the horrible mystery behind his disappearance. So, I don't know. What do you think? There were a lot of claims about Ambrose Small. If the people that claimed to see him on the last night of his disappearance are correct, then it seems like he might not have been at the Grand Opera House during his disappearance. Like he might have actually gone home, which would indicate that he didn't die at the Grand Opera House, so his body would not have been burned in the furnace, and he wouldn't have been kidnapped from there, which would explain why there was no evidence there at all when they tried to go searching there months later. But what about his house? Could Mrs. Small have hired someone to help her get rid of her cheating husband so that she could have the money for herself? There apparently was a rumor she also had a lover of her own, so Mr. Small wasn't the only cheating person in the marriage. She also apparently might have had her own. So maybe her and her lover committed the act. But then what did they do with the body? There is also that other mysterious disappearance from the theatrical community that the older generation had recalled. So if more than one person has disappeared from the theater in Toronto, could that disappearance have any similarities or indicate something else that's going on that we don't know about? I don't know. This mystery seems to have a lot going for it, but I have to say Mrs. Small has a lot going against her, especially when she's trying to get the money from her disappeared husband, 3 years early and just, wants to do what she wants with it, I guess. I'm not sure. But, and the watch is an interesting little tidbit too that I haven't seen come up in a lot of the other articles that I've read. So when I've read that in the newspaper, it kind of made me pause, wondering, well, why didn't the watch get looked into more? I guess a person could go digging into, the court records and stuff, because this is old enough it'd probably be released. But I don't know. You tell me. What do you think happened? Thank you for joining us tonight. And did you know I have a weekly newsletter that includes a link to the latest episode of ParaGhoul Paranormal? Subscribers also receive updates about upcoming events, behind-the-scenes information, and subscriber-only updates related to upcoming book releases, book signings, and more. If you're interested in checking out any of that, then make sure you head over to my website at kdkulpa.com to sign up. If you'd like to support the show and the potential on-location adventures that we're starting to plan, you can find me on most social media platforms under KDKULPA. I also now actually have an Instagram and Facebook page for ParaGhoul Paranormal if you want to check that out so that you know what upcoming episodes are coming. I also have a Patreon for those that want behind-the-scenes information, extra content, and a chance to go join a live with me every month. Now, next week, we are going to be talking about another Canadian legend and monster, and we are going to be going to Quebec for that one, so make sure you join me next week. So stay tuned for our upcoming episodes where we'll uncover more secrets, unravel more mysteries, and delve deeper into the shadows. Until then, remember to keep your flashlight handy and digital recorders ready. This is Katie Kulpa, signing off. Until next time, my ghouls.